Welcome to today's lunchtime lesson, everyone. We're talking about something called Lifesavers today, and I'm going to explain what those mean. So Lifesavers, we're really using this for our speaking. However, all this vocabulary is going to be really useful for your listening too, especially if you're doing any exam listenings, because it helps you understand how a speaker is constructing their ideas. Okay, so useful for speaking, also going to be helpful for listening, especially in exams. So when you're trying to think of something to say in English, you know, someone asks you a question and you're like processing your ideas, what word or what sound do you normally make? Because I'm guessing it's probably one of these, right? So we're probably saying or or yeah. Which, by the way, guys, is totally normal because we do this as well in all of our L1s, right? So whenever you're speaking your first language and someone asks you a difficult question, we also say these words while we're trying to think. The problem is when we're speaking in an L2 in a second language, the pauses can last a lot longer because we're not only processing our ideas, we're also processing how we're going to say this, yeah, in a second language. So the consequences of that. First of all, obviously, this affects your fluency because you're not speaking as connectedly. I'm not even sure if that's the word, as connected as you want to be. Okay, and a sort of consequence of that can also be that it affects your cohesion. So, what's your cohesion? Your cohesion is how you structure or organize your arguments. Yeah. So if you have a very long pause, it's easy for you to forget what you were talking about, or forget for the listener, to forget what the main idea is that you were trying to communicate. Yeah. And depending on what environment you're speaking in, that can have some consequences too. Okay. It can also make you a less interesting speaker to listen to, because if you're taking very long pauses, obviously people don't maybe want to focus on what you're saying so much. And if you're taking an exam, these kind of long pauses are also going to affect your speaking mark too. So that's something that you need to consider. Yeah. Other situations where this would be important is, for example, a job interview. Yeah, so if someone is giving you a job interview in English and you need to think of a quick answer to how you would deal with a problem, a long pause isn't going to look good. And also, if you're in a business meeting, in a presentation, any of these kind of scenarios as well, you want to consider it. Okay, so a way that I like to deal with these long pauses is to use something that I call lifesavers. And what are lifesavers? They're basically just like chunks of language that don't have a lot of meaning necessarily, but they give you some time to think, put your ideas together, and sound much more impressive than going while you're thinking of your answer. Yeah, they're really impressive vocabulary chunks as well, right? So again, if you're taking an exam, that's going to just boost your marks, increase your marks quite quickly. But even if you're not taking an exam, for example, the job interview situation, if you produce these chunks of language, you're going to demonstrate like a higher level of English too. Yeah. So they're all super positive. So here are some examples for you guys, right? So imagine I ask you this very difficult question. Yes, so if you had to choose between love or career, which would it be? So here's one that I could use. Well, that's a tricky one because there are a lot of things to consider. Okay. If I ask you, would you consider moving to a foreign country? It's funny you should say that because I've just taken a job in Mexico and I'm moving next month. Does your country have a strong musical tradition? As a matter of fact, Spain has one of the most famous music traditions in the world, flamenco. Okay, here are some more examples. What would your dream job be? Well, in a perfect world, I'd be a celebrity chef. That'll never happen, so I suppose I'll run my own restaurant. Is having a university degree important nowadays? The problem is that these days everyone has a degree, so if you want to compete in the job market, I'd say a degree is necessary. And finally, should people stop eating meat? To be honest, I don't know enough about the topic to give an educated opinion. Okay, now all of these are really difficult questions. If you are taking an exam, a Cambridge exam or an IELTS exam, I can guarantee they're going to ask you some really, really horrible questions like this. Okay, so keep it in mind. You will be asked these tricky questions. So all of these have different kinds of functions. We use them to express different things. So let's have a look in a bit more detail, okay? Here's quite a big list. I've got 4 different functions: to conclude, to introduce information, to respond to a previous comment, and to hypothesize, right? To imagine, to create a scenario. With your copy of the Jamboard, can you just have a look at these ones here and put them where you think they belong? Okay, so for example, I've never given it much thought. Okay, I'd use that to respond to a previous comment or a previous question. Yeah. Okay, so you know, what do you think about climate change? I've never given it much thought. Okay, as a matter of fact, right, some number 3 and number 2 are quite interchangeable, guys. So as a matter of fact, you could use to introduce information. You could also use it to respond to a previous comment. Okay, all things considered, this would be over here to conclude. Yeah, all right. And let's choose this one here. In a perfect world would be a good way to hypothesize, to imagine what might happen. Okay, so take a few moments, have a look at those options and see if you can organize them for me, right? Where do you think they go? Let's have a look at this one here. That's a tricky one. I think this is my students' favorite expression of all time. So whenever I teach this to people, they just use it all the time, which is brilliant, because it's such a good one to use. So that's a great one to use if someone asks you a very difficult question. Yeah. It's funny you should say that. So again, this could go over here in number 3 or in number 2. But yeah, it's funny you should say that. It's like if somebody's made a comment about something like, oh, would you be interested in learning how to ride a bicycle? And you would say, it's funny you should say that because just yesterday I bought a bicycle. So it's when you have a connection between 2 things. Okay, to the best of my knowledge, right, I would use this to introduce information. Yeah. So when you're not 100% sure about something, but with the information you have. So to the best of my knowledge, it's possible to get your COVID booster jab if you're over 50. When all is said and done, this is a great way to conclude, guys. Okay. I imagine a great way to hypothesize, and so is I'd say. Okay, I would say, I'd say. But remember, we want to make those contractions. Off the top of my head. So this is a great way to respond to previous comments, especially when somebody asks you for ideas, right? So what's the best way that we could solve this problem? And you say, oh, well, off the top of my head. So what I mean is like the first idea that I take out, okay? So off the top of my head, we could try reducing parking costs in the city centre, for example. to be honest, okay, I would use this to respond to a question over here, right? Another one of my students' favorites. Yeah. So to be honest, I've never really given it much thought. At the end of the day, over here to conclude. And funnily enough, I would put that either in number 2 or in number 3. So it's quite similar to this one here. It's funny you should say that, funnily enough. You can think of these as a way of saying interestingly or curiously, but a much more natural way that we would express those in English. Okay, so we have a really big selection here. In no way am I suggesting that you learn all of these. There's a variety there. Choose the ones that have the cuddle factor. Okay, so the cuddle factor, you guys know what a cuddle is? Cuddles like this, yeah. So the cuddle factor is a term to talk about words or phrases which you remember well, right? Because you're attracted to them. Maybe you like the image they create in your mind, or they're easy to remember. So with these kind of expressions, you want to choose ones which you like, for example, that's a tricky one, and are easy for you to produce, because the idea about these expressions is that they're going to give you time, okay? So you don't want to choose one that you can never remember, because it's just going to cause more problems. These are supposed to help you, not complicate your life. So think of ones which are nice and easy for you to use. From an examiner perspective, have a variety, because examiners want you to produce a wide range of functional language. So don't repeat the same 2, but choose 4 or 5 which are easy for you to produce. Yeah. Now, the great thing about them is that you can combine them all, okay? And basically, you can say a really impressive sentence without actually giving any opinions whatsoever. I like to say this is learning how to speak like a politician, okay? So, for example, if someone asks me the question, like the politicians have had recently with COP26, how can we fix climate change? They might say to you, well, to be perfectly honest, that's a tricky one, you know? I haven't given it much thought. And off the top of my head, it's worth bearing in mind that, you know, when all is said and done, at the end of the day, it's going to be difficult. Okay, so in all of that sentence, the only thing that I've actually said is that it's going to be difficult, but I've used all of these other brilliant structures to create a really impressive sentence, which sounds so much better than and is, in again with my examiner hat on, you're expressing a lot of you're demonstrating a lot of different knowledge of structures, of collocations, of advanced vocabulary. Okay, so it's going to increase your communication marks with your grammar and your vocabulary, but also things like your cohesion and how well you're putting it all together. Okay, so to finish, I have a language challenge for you guys, right? Here are some very difficult questions. So let's try that again. Here are some very difficult questions. Yeah, very difficult questions. Okay, so should the death penalty be brought back? Do aliens exist? What's the most important thing you look for a boyfriend or in a girlfriend? What's more important, money or happiness? Should people do military service? What would you say are the main characteristics of Scottish people? I mean, that one's easy because obviously we're fabulous. If you could time travel, what period of the past would you visit? If cloning existed, would you have a clone made of yourself? So these are really challenging questions. What I want you guys to do is take your phone, okay, and you're going to record yourself answering some of these questions. And when you answer the questions, I want you to try and include a selection of the Lifesavers that we've just worked on.